Hi there, this is Chino, and today we are going to discuss or begin our discussion on phrases. And the first kind of phrase that we want to discuss or that we will be discussing is the absolute phrase. Some of you may have heard this term in your grammar classes, in your writing classes, and your teacher may have asked you to use an absolute phrase. And some of you may be wondering what exactly, or some of you may want to know how to form an absolute phrase, which is exactly what we are going to do today. So let me just go ahead and change my pen color to my favorite pen color, red. So what is an absolute phrase? It's an absolute phrase is defined as a reduced sentence with one, a verbal, or a dropped to be verb. Now let's take a look at that closely again. First of all, an absolute phrase is not a sentence. It cannot stand alone. That's why it's called a reduced sentence. It may look like a sentence to begin with, but it actually needs to latch on to another core sentence in order to form a complete sentence. Now, a reduced sentence that has a verbal. Now, you may be asking what a verbal is, and this is a basic definition of a verbal. Verbal is a verb, an action word, plus ing. So in its simplest form, let's say your verb is ski. Your verbal here would be skiing. Okay, so that's how to form a verbal. Now, I will discuss verbals more in depth in my video about verbals. And the next thing we need to discuss, number 2, is a to be verb. Now, to be verbs are here, is, are, was, were. Okay, and to be verbs are known as linking verbs, and again we will discuss to be verbs or linking verbs more in depth when we discuss verbs. Okay, so that's a basic definition of an absolute phrase. Now you may be asking, how do I form an absolute phrase? So you start with forming an absolute phrase starts with a complete sentence. Now this is a sentence, or this is part of a sentence from J.K. Rowling, one of our favorite authors, I'm sure, and her sentence goes, his heart beat very fast. So first thing that I'd like to do, or that I usually do, is I identify the subject and the verb of a core sentence, because this is a core sentence. Its subject obviously being heart, and its verb being beat. Now, how do you form an absolute phrase from this? You take your verb and you add ing. You make it a verbal. So the absolute phrase would be, his heart beat plus ing, beating very fast. Now, if you take a look at this phrase, in fact, I should put a period there. I just put the square brackets here. This phrase is your absolute phrase. Now, the reason why it's an absolute phrase is, first and foremost, it cannot stand alone. Okay, this verb is a verbal, it's incomplete, and what it needs to do, it needs to attach itself to a core sentence to make it a complete sentence. So let's take a look what J.K. Rowling did in her writing. So his heart beating very fast, which is your verbal phrase here. I mean your absolute phrase here. Comma, and it attaches to another core sentence, which Harry stood listening to the chilly silence. Now, if you're going to take a look at the core sentence, this is your subject, this is your verb, so it is a core sentence, it can stand alone, but your absolute phrase and your absolute phrase attaches onto this core sentence, making the sentence more embellished. It gives more description to Harry right here. So in effect, an absolute phrase is almost like an adjective. It works to modify your noun or the subject of the sentence. Let's take a look at another example. His black robes rippled in a cold breeze. Again from J.K. Rowling. Now, what you want to do, of course, first identify the subject, the verb. The verb you want to change to a verbal. So you would do rippling. Okay. So I would just cross this out here for our purposes. I won't write it all out because it's a pretty long sentence or an absolute phrase. So the absolute phrase would be, his black robes rippling in a cold breeze. So let's see how J.K. Rowling uses this. She adds the word there. His black robes rippling in a cold breeze, which is your absolute phrase, stood Severus Snape. Okay, so what she did in effect is she took this sentence, made it into an absolute, and used it in the middle of a core sentence right here. So again, this absolute phrase serves as a descriptor. It gives an additional description to what Severus Snape is doing, or how Severus Snape looks. Let's take a look at another example. His arms were folded across his chest. Okay, now here you don't even need to change folded into a verbal. As we saw in the definition, one way to form an absolute is to drop the linking verb. So all you have to do in this case, drop the were. His arms folded across his chest becomes your absolute phrase. Okay? And let's see how the author uses this. So if I were to write this, his arms folded across his chest. You can start off with this absolute phrase. You could put it at the end, and as long as it latches on to a core sentence. Okay, and let's see what our author does. Bradley had been leaning against the wall when I came into his room. Now, this is your core sentence right here. Okay, and uses the comma, so that signals that this absolute phrase is about to be attached to the end of his sentence, or her sentence, because Harper Lee is the one who wrote this sentence from To Kill a Mockingbird. So Radley had been leaning against the wall when I came into his room, comma, his arms folded against his chest. See how great these authors use, or what a great way to embellish your sentence using absolute phrases. And let's take a look at another example. Ooh, The Hobbit. So we probably know who wrote this sentence. The Hobbit stood by the gray stone, and the dwarves watched impatiently. So let's make this an absolute phrase. You have your subject. You have your verb here, stood by the gray stones, and the dwarves. This is another subject, and this is another verb. So in fact, this is a compound sentence, and technically there would be a comma here. Okay, the Hobbit stood by the gray stone, and the dwarves watched impatiently. So the verb, you want to make a verbal. You want to go, the Hobbit standing, your verbal, ing, by the gray stone, and the dwarves watching impatiently. And let's see how the author, in this case Tolkien, uses the absolute phrase. They all fell silent. Now this is your core sentence right here. And you can see that he will be attaching his phrase shortly. The Hobbit standing by the gray stone, and the dwarves watching impatiently. There you go.